of Colombia, Senior Advocate Mr. Batra, diplomats, members of the legal fraternity, friends. I have to repeat when I get some generous introductions, my favorite anecdote about a bishop who was invited as a after-dinner speaker and introduced in similar glowing terms by his hosts as Atul has done this morning. So when it came to the bishop's turn to speak, as it is now my turn to speak, he started by saying that he must seek 2 forgivenesses, as I now do myself. The first, he said, is the forgiveness for Atul Sharma for having exceeded the bounds of truth. The second, said the bishop, and so do I say now, the second for myself for having enjoyed it so much. Friends, talking or inviting a lawyer or a parliamentarian to talk about mediation, and that too to professors and diplomats, hopefully there are some diplomats today, is in a way not as strange as it might sound, because both rely on advocacy and persuasiveness as common factors. It may be a different matter that neither lawyers nor parliamentarians can quite match diplomats in their art of persuasiveness. My favorite one about the talent of diplomats to persuade is the definition of a diplomat as a person who can ask people to go to hell in a way in which they actually start looking forward to the journey. For lesser versions of that diplomacy, I think it's an effective diplomat who lets someone else have your way and makes the other person think that he's having his or her own way. But let me say that it's very intimidating at having found out after entering this room that there are professors who teach only this subject or specifically this subject at Columbia as part of an audience. That's a bit of an ambush by Atul Sharma because I certainly have none of the academic expertise which these great people have. But I must tell you that I have a very long association with mediation, not of this kind, because this must, although there are lots of common factors, all mediations have common factors, all mediations have common principles, all mediations have common objects. But we must always keep this mediation in a very special sui generis category within the category of different mediations. But my own association with mediation goes back to 1993. In a very intimate way, when there was no Samadhan, there was no High Court Mediation Center in India. And the Chief Justice of India, Chief Justice Ahmadi, who was known for somehow getting the pipeline of justice unclogged as fast as he could, made a team of 3 or 4 Indian judges and lawyers, Supreme Court judges, and the 2 lawyers were me and Dipankar Gupta, now deceased, along with a team of 4 American judges and lawyers, Court of Appeal judges, just 1 notch below the Supreme Court, and 2 lawyers. And the 7 or 8 of us studied the Californian system, where actually the most successful origin of mediation had happened in the early 80s or even earlier. And we spent some 3 lovely summers of 10, 12 days each at San Francisco, a city with which I am in love since then, possibly the world's most liberal city, where we studied that closely. And ultimately our efforts produced a report which led to a report to which I had done very much of the writing, which led to the Section 82 in our Civil Procedure Code today. That's a direct descendant, an outcome of that report, which provides a menu card of alternatives for mediation in the civil proceedings in Indian courts. And we had all the nuances because we saw a close quarter study. For example, we do not have in India, we could not provide in India. We wanted to, we discussed that, but we couldn't provide the judicial settlement model of mediation, which statistically was found to be the most successful, at least in California, which I studied, and possibly in the whole of USA, where a sitting judge, not being the trial judge, becomes the mediator. We tried strongly to persuade, but we already have so much deficiency of judges and vacancies of judicial posts that there was no way in which we could ask India to provide sitting judges who could not clear the roster to have additional duties as mediators. But we do have now in that section all the various different forms: conciliation, mediation, arbitration, lok adalat, and so on and so forth. But the operationalization of that provision since then is the more important part, is the more heartening and congratulatory part, because that was only theory, and it was intellectually very satisfying for me to be part of that. But what has now happened in terms of operationalization is much more important. And let me end on this part by connecting with what Atul said. I was amazed when, way back in '93 when I studied this, for about 3 years we went to San Francisco, that at that early time there was a firm called JAMS, I still remember the name, Judicial Arbitration Mediation Services, a firm of lawyers doing only arbitration mediation work, and in those early years doing more of mediation than even arbitration, because arbitration is actually in many ways I would call a fake form of mediation. It's the first original bypass to litigation, but now it is in many ways in India certainly possibly more formal than litigation. Yes. We rightly call in India pre-litigation litigation. So, but it was heartening to find JAMS in the early 90s doing exclusive work of arbitration and mediation and already exceeding in numbers. I don't know what's happened to it now, it must be flourishing. And subsequent to that, I was associated with Ms. Caroline, whom again the mafia of mediation must know, at the Center of European Dispute Resolution, which was another product of the same origins. But the point I'm making is that it is important to create such structures in India. There is no reason why more and more lawyers should not congregate to make exclusive mediation-oriented practices. And somehow that psychological impression of that being a second line of lawyering or a second-class citizenry of lawyering is the psychological mindset you will get out of. And over time, I believe, not in my lifetime, because I'm good only for appearing in court, nothing else, but certainly after us, that may well be the first line of practice and not what we do as mad, chaotic litigants every day in court. Well, friends, having said that generally about ADR, let me turn to the fact that, as I said, though different, and we must remember the differences, mediation in all forms has great commonalities. And they start with the commonality of wanting consensual results, not imposed ones. Litigation and even arbitration are imposed results. Mediation, by definition, and all forms of it are supposed to be consensual results. There is automatically a virtue in those two definitions, by contrast. One cannot be as good as the other, because one is imposed, the other comes from within, howsoever modified it might be. And of course, in the case of nations, the equivalent of litigation is war and strife. So the object of preventing litigation is the achievement of prevention of war and strife. So there is, in that sense, a more virtuous subset of mediation is this kind of mediation, international or supranational or between nations. But the objects ultimately, even there, have to be more or less the same. It is what I've called long ago in an article, the ABCD. The access for A, the B for backlog, the C for cost, and the D for delay. In some form or the other, these things matter as much in the international arena as they do for other forms of domestic and international arbitration, except that the consequences of failure in the former are far more disastrous than in the latter. Or they both rely and must rely on a third party, the so-called neutral. They all rely on the neutral supposedly having features of objectivity, trust, gravitas, stature, without which I think no mediation can really succeed, domestic, international, or this kind. They do all apply similar technology, the technology which Professor Fisher has so nicely described. It is getting from no to yes. The technology is the same, whether it is nations or individuals or companies. It is to get from no to yes, and the path and the manner and the way to do it that technology called mediation. It is to open and make people aware and see the different definitions of self-interest. That's really the essence of mediation. Self-interest is not merely the way you see your self-interest, the way I see it, but there's a third way in which an efficient and effective mediator makes you see self-interest. It is to put the virtue of quiet, hard, behind the scenes hard work over public posturing. And it is, in that sense, as a very well-known diplomat, Richard Holbrooke, said, it's pretty much like jazz. It's endless variations on a theme or on a tune. Well, friends, peacemaking through negotiation has had a pretty respectable lineage, and possibly even a more respectable lineage in India than abroad or than in the West. Although commonly the examples we start off are the Greek village elders or the Greek state mediation techniques. Then of course the Roman ones. But the Mahabharata and the Ramayana are replete with different nations being mediated. Nations in those days, of course, were states or principalities or rulers being mediated. There are innumerable instances. Draupadi's father had a big mediation with another neighboring thing, with a third king acting as a mediator. And you had, of course, along with that, liberal doses of mythology, where gods mediated between two different deities. Otherwise, there would be absolute catastrophe for all other ordinary mortals like us if that mediation hadn't succeeded. More recent examples go back to 1825, where I find UK, possibly for preventing yearnings of independence elsewhere in the British colonies, mediated a Rio Treaty between Portugal and Brazil, which more or less ended Brazil's war of independence. But it was an effective treaty because Portugal and Brazil kept quiet for many, many decades after that. That was in 1825. And that was pretty much this kind of mediation by one nation between two nations. Pope Leo XIII did it in 1885 between Germany and Spain for what is now known as, then known as the Spanish East Indies, Caroline Island, and along with Marshall and Marina Islands. Of course, back home, closer home, the most impressive example, well, not quite satisfactory in today's current jingoistic nationalist climate. By retrospect, not quite satisfactory, but then perhaps the most outstanding example is the Tashkent settlement of 1966, largely brokered by Russia between India and Pakistan. And even more famous, perhaps the most famous and very creditable, was Anwar Sadat's 77th visit to Israel, followed by Jimmy Carter's great achievement to have the Egypt-Israel peace treaty, which till today has demilitarized the Sinai Peninsula and definitely saved many, many, many tragic deaths. I was mentioning to the lady here about Senator George Mitchell's success in getting Northern Ireland to have shared governance between the Unionists and the Nationalists. And he did it on Good Friday in Belfast. And it's a memorable day today because despite breaches, it has saved many, many lives. And in fact, the entire form of governance till today in Northern Ireland between Unionists and Nationalists is based broadly on that senator's achievement. Now, the architecture for this mediation is fairly well known. It's the operationalization of that which needs to be enhanced. The architecture starts from virtually the beginning of the UN Charter. In Article 2, Para 3, quote, shall settle their international disputes through peaceful means. That's virtually the opening words, or shortly after the opening words of the UN Charter. And I was surprised to note Article 33 is so much more explicit, because it says, in the widest possible words actually, extremely wide and most comprehensive, quote, seek solution by negotiation, inquiry, mediation, conciliation, arbitration, judicial settlement, resort to resort to other agencies, resort to regional agencies or arrangements or other peaceful means of their own choice. I can't think of a wider, all-inclusive definition drafted by some domestic lawyer covering all forms of mediation, but applied very effectively to all forms of international or inter-nation mediation. Of course, it is the UN which has to take the leadership in these matters, and it has, to the extent it has. You have the Peace Building Commission. You have, of course, the UNITA, the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, which does exemplary work to build models like this, and most important, workshops to train people in this. And I hear that Colombia has collaborated fruitfully with such initiatives as UNITA, because to teach the technology to people to do it is the most important part of it. I was intrigued to find that between nations, but purely for trade, Singapore understandably will always deal only with trade, they have, as recently as 7th of August 2019, a mediation convention, which was open for signature on 7th of August 2019. On the first day, 46 countries, including India, have signed it. It's the same kind of mediation, but inter-nation on the corporate trade side of it. So these are initiatives which need to be expanded, replicated, duplicated, and operationalized on a wider canvas. Well, friends, I think ultimately the great worth of this is obvious, self-evident. It is preventive diplomacy is put at the forefront by these techniques. And there is no better form of diplomacy than preventive diplomacy. It, of course, I think has to, and I'm sure the courses these people teach at Columbia and other places must be dealing in great nuanced detail with these things. But my personal view is that it has not yet fully dealt with new paradigms and developments in contemporary world over the last 10 to 20 years, which is according to me the biggest threat to this mediation as it is the biggest threat to humanity. And that is terrorism and the divisiveness which terrorism breeds. Because terrorism doesn't mean only the physical impact. There is a huge amount of other fear, psychosis and divisiveness. And into that, to fit the paradigms of mediation about which we speak, is a new challenge which certainly the United Nations framers of these articles could not have anticipated for its intensity or for its width. The other aspect, of course, which is a big dampener for mediation, would be this, according to me, fictional difference or vanishing point difference between so-called state actors and non-state actors. Because by definition, non-state actors are supposed to have some degree of state sponsorship. But if you feed in mediation into scenarios where the principal basis of division is state and non-state actors, you have another new challenge which deserves more and more attention. Well, as has been said about democracy, it's the worst form of governance, but it's the best available alternative. So mediation is probably the most prosaic, quiet, boring kind of work. But believe me, there is no better form of dispute resolution available. Unless you invent one, you have to do with this. It is really because mediation recognizes that while conflict is inevitable, combat is optional. And this hiatus between conflict and combat is the barrier of time and space. If mediation succeeds only to put that barrier of time and space, that itself by itself would be a big achievement for mediation. Because otherwise conflict is followed by combat with the same inevitability, which is the precise problem. People have said that it is therefore, in a sense, the most effective tool of non-violence, of ahimsa, to which Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King were committed. It is the best tool to take you away from conflict to compromise. Mediation, of course, must look for grand successes. It must look, as they say in the ideal mediation, both parties should go away feeling, looking, and possibly being happy, or at least feeling happy. But Churchill said a very nice thing. He said some of the best settlements are those from which both parties depart equally unhappy. The important point is not unhappiness, the important point is equally. As long as they're equally unhappy, you've got a good settlement. And I think both of these have to be married into effective mediation, as much in individuals, as much between corporates, as between nations. It is for this reason that John Kennedy made those memorable words, truly memorable, which must be etched on the front of every nation, inter-nation mediation effort. Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate. In this exercise, the principal soldiers of peace mediation are diplomats, the community of diplomats. And in that sense, like lawyers, they are wordsmiths, because a wrong word is all the difference between a lightning striking and a lightning not striking. And it is for these diplomats ultimately, or trained academics who practice this form of diplomacy, to create both the time and space to allow the peace-building architecture to take root. In that, they are doing human service to humanity. In that, they are doing human service to the subject of international law. In that, they are doing human service to all of us. Thank you so much.